Bob is now going to reintroduce us to a talk that he gave around about 1980. It is the myth of unemployment in the free market society. Myth of mass unemployment in the free market society, I should say. Mass unemployment. I'll hand it over to Bob.
As it happens, any form of unemployment is entirely mythical. Now, this paradoxical utterance can't quite mean what one would take it to mean. And it does, and it doesn't. The talk I gave 27 years ago, this is a more considered talk, a little longer, and if you inclined to the labour theory of value, so much better for being a little longer. The outline goes like this. I should insist that full employment is inevitable and optimum employment is impossible. Therefore, I have to explain what I mean by employment. And the real problem, and it is a problem, the real shame, it is a shame, the real tragedy, and it is a tragedy, of what we call chronic mass unemployment, is actually a form of very sub-optimal employment or integration into an economy. I will work my way, by way of justification or explanation of this, by talking about the natural economy, then moving on to a politicised economy. By natural economy, I lay myself open to all sorts of accusations from collectivists and Marxists that I'm merely engaging in calling something natural when it's what I like, and it may be wholly unnatural and entirely class-rigged. I shall be accused, were you here now, by an ex-philosophy student with a beard, like myself, that I'm engaging in a Robinsonade. That's Marx's term for it. In other words, as economists often do, they have recourse to taking you to a desert island, usually by yourself. And in fact, they should be called a deserted island. I blame Roy Plumley for this. And desert island discs. It is, in fact, a deserted island and not a desert at all, otherwise you wouldn't last 5 minutes.
Suppose nobody's ever been there, then it isn't even dirt.
Good point.
It's just barren.
Barren.
Of persons.
Barren of persons. Quite so.
An impersonal island.
Something like that. Also,
uninhabited islands.
If one engages in the Robinsonade, and it's usually done, well, in fact, invariably done, merely to allow the student to grasp certain concepts all the more clearly. After that, you may, as with Wittgenstein and his ladder, you may kick it away. You don't need it anymore. I mean, economics is, and always is, a social science, and has to be a social science. And how a Thatcherite, such as, well, Mrs. Thatcher, for example, how a Thatcherite can be accused of ignoring the social and thinking that there is no such thing as society is ludicrous. Plainly, Mrs. Thatcher, in the famous truncated quotation, believes in society. Indeed, if you advocate the market economy, that is quintessentially a social phenomenon, and has to be, and is inescapably so. Therefore, when one does talk about a natural economy or illustrates certain economic concepts by having a person alone on the island deciding whether to make this, whether to make fishing nets, whether to fish, whether to go for coconuts, and explaining to you the idea of opportunity costs and marginal cost. If he has a sack of grain and loses some grain, what goes first? Well, he strangles his parrot, then he loses his dog. You work your way through to the less important uses are the ones given up first. So it's merely a way of explaining. So when one has recourse to the idea of a natural economy, or by way of illustration, has recourse to Robinson Crusoe on his island before Friday turns up. This is purely for explication. So if I speak of a natural economy, it would be a purely commercial economy. There would be private property, or a kind of communal property. I mean, footpaths are a kind of common property, but you don't have the right to do people don't have the right to do what they like with them. There are certain laws concerning them, or certain conventions which have to be, well, you have to go along with them or suffer the consequences. So a natural economy is one in which it's pure commerce all the way down, as it were. There is no state money, there is no state law any more than there is a state language. You don't need the state to have a language, you don't need a state for there to be laws. You don't need there to be a state to have property acknowledged, parcelled up in various ways, and independently used. Now, it may be that very often, for historical reasons, societies haven't quite got the whole lot. They may have not quite got the pure thing, but very often will. But for the purposes of explanation and analysis, we can suppose that we do have an evolved society from way back in which people pretty much know who owns what, don't object bitterly to, in most cases, to who owns it, certainly not to the idea of personal property. There may be squabbles about who actually owns it, disputed wills, disputed land, troubles of damage to other property owners, that kind of thing. So we go through a natural economy. This is just a plan, by the way. We then move on to the politicised economy, which we're overly familiar, I fear to say, in which the idea of, quotes, chronic mass unemployment is explained, and in which your speaker explains that it takes an awful lot of politics to get market failure. If you have total market, you hardly get market failure at all. In fact, apart from the fact it can't do the impossible, it stands guilty of that accusation. But what it can do, it does do. But it takes politics to get so-called market failure. Right. 27 years ago, this is the after-amble, having had the preamble, I was a vulgar Keynesian. I'm half the man I was then. I'm just vulgar, I'm no longer a Keynesian. I read my Penguin books, and I read my Michael Stewart, Keynes and After. I recently reread his After Keynes and After book that he wrote in the 90s, laying into Mrs. Thatcher. And I'd read Galbraith, and I'd read others. And so I knew that, the Great Slump, and the 19th century, and little boys up chimneys, women down the mines, that kind of thing. So I knew I didn't accept a laissez-faire economy. I knew when I was a card-carrying liberal, I was so embarrassed I never actually spoke to anybody at one of the meetings I went to. And partly because I couldn't find the Conservative Party in the town. But having seen the Liberals and having read Hayek, I was moving so-called rightwards or market ways by that time. So I was a vulgar Keynesian. I read the arguments, such as they are. The Keynesian revolution, aggregate demand failure, market failure. And it seemed reasonable enough. I mean, everyone was going along with it. That's the way we usually work, isn't it? Until you can see an argument against it, you think, well, they're clever fellows. They've been to Oxford and things. They kind of got this wrong. And that's the position I was. Then I discovered Hayek and Mises, Rothbard and the rest of the gang. And more importantly, I found the arguments to show why Keynes wasn't quite the bright spark he was. Some modern libertarians, especially American ones, like to think that Keynes is a mad or a nihilist. He didn't believe in the future because he thought in the future, in the long run, we're all dead. Well, that was just something flippant to say and amusing in context. But he certainly concerned himself with the future. He did think that the Victorian idea of always laying up money and never actually enjoying it was, economically inefficient and a bit of a moral failure. But he wasn't a fraud. He did believe he was a great man who had achieved a great insight into the workings of an unrestrained market economy. He did think he'd achieved a kind of Copernican shift. He thought of himself, in one letter I believe, or two, that he was a kind of Einstein. That was then, this is now. That was Newtonian, this is going to be Einsteinian, or rather a Keynesian. So I don't accuse him of being either a fool or a fraud or a nihilist. He was an intelligent man, perhaps a genius, a great propagandist, and he was wrong. It happens. Even people who are not any of those things can actually tumble to the fact that they're wrong, especially if they read other people. Right, so that's me ceasing to be a vulgar Keynesian. But we'll leave Keynes a bit now. We go back to my first bold claim, which is that unemployment is impossible. For this reason. Every baby, every retiree, even, has to make use of what they have available to them, either de jure or de facto theirs to use, like mother's nipple and other things, and they have to perform certain actions. It may be, in the case of babies, fairly automatic, but it's good if they gurgle and smile and say mama and the rest of it and look nice. If they simply try to chew the end off, which they apparently do sometimes. A poor mother's breast, and never smiled and shouted abuse at them, her head twisted round and round.
Sad daughter.
They'd have to hope that a dutiful parent did the right thing instead of just feeling that they wanted to do the right thing. So this is no flippant remark, well, not just a flippant remark, that babies and retirees have to work. They do. Work is human action combined with a capital, which can be human and non-human capital. In other words, we are every day, every conscious moment, we are doing something to make our lives either better or less bad or not getting worse. We employ thought, movement, and not with any old thing, with things that we have the right to. Now, obviously, our own body and our own mind, pretty much, present is left to us to make use of. So even a man on an iron lung, as they no longer called, at least he would think about things, or he might blink to call for attention, or whatever it might be. So even he is doing his level best in the circumstances, using what he may to maintain a psychic income, and for that he has to do material things, plus immaterial things, if they are immaterial, such as thinking and cogitating. So at that level, and this is no, well, in a sense it's trifling, because most people have to say, well, yes, in that sense, you're right. But that's not what we mean when we talk about chronic mass unemployment. Well, give me time. This will help to explain it. But you're not Robinson on his island. You are working in society, and usually working with things that you own, and more often than not, things that your employer owns. And you're happy to do so because, for reasons familiar to us all, it's far more productive to be part of an extended order, a market economy, with specialist production. It's called division of labour. I prefer to say specialised production. And within the specialised production unit, there's very often division of labour. But it helps to mention both things. Now, Marxists and communists used to, they don't do it so much now because they're sort of vulgar Keynesians, I suppose. They used to try to ignore the money. They thought the money was detracted attention from the important things. The essential thing is we can make it, we can hack it, we can share it, and we can prosper. And if it wasn't for the knowledge problem, as Hayek and Mises pointed out, perhaps there's something in there. But we've found, it has been found, and explain why, that extended orders of production and specialist production cannot work without prices and markets for capital goods, not just consumer goods. And there must be free markets, not playing at markets, not setting prices, but allowing firms to offer prices, prosper or fail, as a consequence. So, although when I speak of a natural order, I include money within that idea of a natural order. Rather, as with language, we find that humans everywhere pretty much, well, everywhere have a language, and pretty much everywhere have a money too, or an exchange good. Sometimes, apparently, it's been all sorts, I think wampum, leather, tobacco, cowrie shells. But generally speaking, it converges towards, well, it hides cattle. But it's not so easy to divide 4 hooves and maintain the utility of the various parts if they're separated. So it's, as you know, it's come down to precious metals over the years, pretty much. Copper, silver and gold. So when I talk of a natural economy, it will be an economy with money, with law, with private property, with exchange and the rest, but no politics. Unless a certain sociologists would insist that there's politics everywhere. There's politics in the hairdressers, there's politics in the office, there's politics... Oh, yes and no. If you mean as I do by politics, someone has the force of the hangman behind them, or a lesser equivalent, then that's politics. And if it isn't there in the hairdressers and it isn't there in the office, there ain't politics. That's my way of saying it. You might want it in word, but they should recognise the difference and the phenomenon. Now, with a natural order, natural economic order, I hold there will be not general equilibrium, not even, I think, a general tendency towards general equilibrium. People will be in the wrong place to making the wrong thing, and this will be revealed by the fact that firms will make losses. And some firms will make super profits. It will not be a standard return to all investments. It isn't necessary for there to be a general equilibrium. I've said before, we could do better than the optimum. You can have an optimum sharing or working out of a society without growth, economy without growth. It's far better to have the growth and the discovery that goes inevitably with profits and losses. So it's better to have, in that sense, suboptimality for something better than the optimum, which is suboptimal growth or improvement. We are still in our natural economy. So, given profit and loss, there would be redundancy. Yes, that's true. Now, redundancy would simply mean shifting for yourself, shifting from for most people, one employer to another. Now, some economists, such as Alchin and Allen, famous double act, they would say that you're not really unemployed in the short run. Say you're living on your savings, or your friendly society has a benefit that we pay for a few weeks whilst you find a new job, or your union says, well, if you're prepared to move and take a pay cut, a job is assured. Now, these things are entirely possible, and I think would be there as a natural order within the natural order if it wasn't for the politics. So there would be redundancy, but it would not be, in a sense, involuntary unemployment that follows. It will be voluntary unemployment because you think, well, I won't get the first job. I can do better than that, possibly. I know I'm better than that. I've got the skills, so I can't just get any job. I can afford to go for a while till I find a better one. Now, that is acknowledged to be redundancy followed by voluntary unemployment. In fact, what's retirement but voluntary unemployment, in a sense? You can afford not to work, so you don't. So that's voluntary unemployment, except in my sense of you're always working, but you're clever enough to keep the two meanings separate for now until I have to bring them together again. It will be alleged by Keynesians and others that even in this, quote, natural economy, that there will be booms and slumps, or there will be occasional crises, or there will be sudden losses of animal spirits by investors, and the system will fall into a possibly stable equilibrium, but a low employment equilibrium in the usual sense. Well, I won't do that quite yet. I will first, next, move on to the idea of chronic unemployment, which just means for a long time. Like many modern youth, I thought chronic meant bad, very bad. Right, chronic, innit? It's chronic. It means very bad. As the educated people here know, it relates to chronology, time. So chronic unemployment is prolonged unemployment, or there's always someone being unemployed and in receipt of benefit, let's say. And
I thought it meant acute.
You think so?
Yes.
Is that just a false friend then, the Kronos?
You thought chronic meant acute. Acute means severe.
Oh, I thought that.
Yes, that's what you thought. Right. That's what
But I now know.
Yes.
It means prolonged. Or someone's always at it. It didn't mean like someone being drunk all the time. It's not the same poor man. Or there's someone falling down a flight of steps every 30 seconds. The poor man, if we could find him and put him on the ground floor. No, so chronic meant there's always some degree of unemployment. My view would be, again, as I said earlier, it takes a good deal of politics to get such a case of market failure. Indeed, there's a necessary condition of chronic unemployment that someone has to help the person afford it. In fact, someone has to pay the person to play the role, or continuing the role of, the chronically unemployed. That's the great insight that I delivered. It's not my own, but still, I think it's true. That if a state employee, let's say, has a real job, they've got a job, because they get a wage packet, and they pay tax and national insurance, of course. They don't pay net tax, and they don't really pay national insurance either, because that comes out of the wage, and the wage comes out of taxation. And so as a the previous speaker, Mark Littlewood, pointed out that even if nurses and the rest, state-employed nurses, are useful, and therefore perhaps in one sense not parasitic, they certainly cannot contribute, unless they have other forms of income, which are taxed, they cannot contribute to the net tax take. They must be tax eaters, as the 18th century term had it, and there were tax growers and there were tax eaters, and the two are not the same. So if it's a job to be a teacher or a nurse, let alone someone who gives permission to people to do what they ought not to be required to ask permission to do, if all are equally jobs because they receive a wage and they're doing what someone who provides a wage wants them to do or is pleased them to do, or at least thinks they deserve a wage in consequence, then I cannot see, in all conceptual honesty, how you can say that a person in receipt of unemployment benefit is not working. That was my point, that was my joke back in those days. Oh, I work for the government, because I've had periods when I was drawing unemployment benefit and getting back my grandfather's tax. That's my excuse. Also, I wasn't fit enough for a job, possibly, at the going wage. But that's another part of the explanation. So there I was, working for the government. They required me to attend and put my name on a piece of paper every 2 weeks.
Sinecure.
A sinecure, as we have joked many times. It wasn't much of a job, but it wasn't much of a wage. So I don't know what they expected more than that.
It's like the USSR. We pretend to work and they pretend to pay us.
Exactly the same. Now, I know that a modern economist, even of the most right-wing, pro-market views, would say, no, you can't say that. You're insulting the unemployed. No, I'm not insulting the unemployed. I feel very sorry for the unemployed. There are reasons why it's difficult to get a job, to be explained. But in the circumstances, it cannot be denied that turning up in somewhere with a rubber plant, a desk, a mat, some herb at the other side of the desk, is mixing, as I refer back to the beginning, you are, in the circumstances, using your body, your human capital, mixing it with the human capital of others, with the labour of others, with land and capital, to receive, a monetary handing over. Now, if that's not a wage, what is a wage? Now, you don't want that, in one sense, so you don't turn it down. So in a very plain sense, you want it, in the circumstances, and your employer wants to give it. Now, what are the reasons for this? What services do the unemployed masses provide? At this stage, they're only chronic. We haven't got mass unemployment. We have 250,000 continually or something, and some of those for years at a time, but still, it's just chronic unemployment. But it has, unless it's simply a chronic unemployment of people being between jobs, job searching using their own money to look for a job, that kind of chronic unemployment exists. But if it's the state-funded variety, where jobs are not to be had, and in a sense they're not, at the going rate, in the circumstances, then you're plainly working. Now, what service are you providing to your employer? Well, you're showing that they're a caring government. You're showing that they're an enabling state. You're showing that the market is a desperately unfair and inefficient system. I mean, you're providing all sorts of jolly services to politicians of the sort they very much like to have provided to them. So I think, to compound the argument, that is most certainly providing a service, especially as they stump up money that they can get from other people to get you to carry on in this manner. That must certainly be regarded as a job if jobs are not required to have liberty at each end, which on other days of the week I will argue that essentially a free market job has to be money voluntarily got, earned, peacefully earned, and voluntarily given, in which case no tax-funded employee has a real job. They have a task and they have their reward, but I would go so far as to say libertarians should not use the same terms almost. They shouldn't say wage and job, they should say, I don't know, duty and duty and bung, whatever you want to say. There seems to be some objection to my my diatribe.
Is this some religious ceremony which I'm unaware of?
I don't.
Russian Union.
Ah.
This Soviet.
Yeah, they're getting their own back.
The Russian Union, they're in a rush because they're behind.
Now that's so we have natural redundancy, even in a pure natural market order. There will be redundancy. There will be firms going down. There will be whole regions declining. There will be new industries arising. This is a good thing, on balance. Even for those who have to shift and move and take a pay cut, their pay over time, even at the lower amounts, will buy more because of the whole systematic working out of redundancy. The whole history of improvement is a history of redundancy, I like to say. Not so jolly if thought the redundant one, but no. Although it should be acknowledged that in, let's have a guess here, at least 25% of the cases, people who are made redundant find themselves in a job they actually prefer. Even if it's not paying more, though it very often may be. Simply because they didn't like the idea of moving, and who does? Well, some do. Some do like to change jobs and move, but not a majority, I don't think. But having been obliged to look around and get another job, they find that actually it's a better one. So that isn't sufficiently acknowledged, but there is redundancy built in. But I don't think there is chronic unemployment built in if it's of the same people through a long time. So how do we get from there to chronic mass unemployment? Now, this is where Mr. Keynes makes his reappearance, the idea of market failure and the collapse in aggregate demand. Now, I think there can be a collapse in aggregate demand. I do not deny such a thing. Though again, it takes a state monetary system very often to produce the crisis, and it takes a state benefit system to prolong the crisis. It takes a state planning system to prolong the prolongation of the crisis. You see my drift. But how do we get the apparent crisis inherent to a market order, as Keynes and others think? Well, there are various ways. War, I think I blame the state for that. Famine, to be fair, no. Inundation, tsunamis and the rest of it. In other words, a sudden loss of output which isn't there to be exchanged, output which means what output there is, say it's of grain or whatever it might be, is now more expensive, which means that people have to buy less of it or buy as much of it as usual, but less of other things. This will have repercussions for the rest of the economy. People will find themselves being made redundant, if only in the short run. And these things have to be adjusted to. This can be adjusted to very rapidly, unless the state glues the whole thing up and stops it adjusting. It's rather like the decline of an industry, only a bit quicker. People have to shift, they have to take pay cuts, they have to not do what they would prefer to do, not to use the skills they have and to acquire other ones. But these things can be got through. That's in the natural disasters in the natural economy. But now we have monetary disasters in our politicised economy. Despite the description of the last few years as unregulated, unrestrained capitalism, the banking disaster, the financial disaster is in fact an investment disaster, which follows upon the state monetary system, state monetary provision being of such a deliberately loose kind, that there has been a bubble in many things, a boom in the economy, and an inevitable bust. That is not the only way we can have a recession, but that's pretty much the way it's happened over the years. I do think that even purely market-provided commercial money would allow, or not prevent, wouldn't cause, bubbles, as with the tulip mania and the railway bubble. I mean, people just get it into their heads that that's the latest thing. That's going to really work. You know, delivering pet food by internet. Now it's going to work. Now, as in the dot-com bubble, it didn't work. But businesses that were set up and were no more than a name and an idea, a website, they sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they'd never made a bean, and they sold. I mean, it seems astonishing now, but many of them didn't fold. And if you got into Amazon early enough, perhaps you made a pile. So I don't deny that there can be bubbles, even in a pure monetary, metallic metal exchange system. So there's no fractional reserve banking. There's just coins and notes for convenience, which are just titles to money in the bank. However, I do not think that you can get the full-scale crisis that we enjoyed in 2008 toward 2007 it started, and 2008 it arrived, without state monetary provision and, more to the point, credit expansion of a gung-ho kind, which they did. Coupled with, as it happens, unlike in theory, when in the good days you put something aside for the rainy day and you load up the treasure chest, but they'd either lost the key or they lost the chest, because it wasn't saved up over the last 10 years by Gordon Brown and the rest. Why? It's a new paradigm. There's never going to be a downturn. We don't need to. We can borrow more and more. We owe it to our future selves. Or rather, well, they're going to be paying for it, but still, we owe it to ourselves now. I mean, by golly, we're going to borrow, because we don't tell the people that what it would cost in taxation. It needn't be that way. It was that way. But the state monetary system is the one that will give you the recession. Now, that's a separate talk, so I won't go into the full details. Having had the crisis, what do they do? Well, in 1928, and this was partly to get back to the pre-war price levels in America and over here, there was an attempt to get back to certainly in this country, the gold standard of pre-war, which was unwise. It wasn't wise. There are few economists argue for it. Even then, Cannon did, and W.H. Hutt, he said it is a point of honour that the British borrowed on the basis that a pound was so much gold, and they ought to pay back on that basis. And it would have meant, and did mean, and it was being adjusted to, that many wages nominally had to fall. Not real wages, but nominal wages had to fall. Although, in the circumstances, it meant you could buy less, of course. Your wage would purchase less, but it was not in gold terms any higher than it ought to be. And they sort of got through with that for a while, but then caved in. The Bank of England wouldn't raise interest rates high enough to defend the gold parity, and so finally threw the thing over. And it may be like on another occasion it was said by Milton Friedman that deflating is a bit like having run over someone with a car. You then back over them again to make up for it. So once you've done the inflating, just stop, but you don't have to deflate. Just leave it alone and have a new parity. That would perhaps have been better, but they didn't do that. So we have our monetary induced slump. We have the benefit system. We have the planning system. So what would you do I think it was Benjamin Britten, or one of that crowd, who entitled a little work for children, Let's Make an Opera. Well, let's make a slump. And how would you do it? Well, you'd have the monetary expansion. Okay. You'd have the crisis. Then interest rates would have to be jacked up to protect pound against, well, if not against gold, at least against other currencies. So interest rates would shoot up. Not that they did here, but they normally did in the past. And we've had the crisis even with without interest rates shooting up. So it can be done. But that's not all. You really need, what would you do? Well, you'd have minimum wage rates that made people not worth employing at the price. You'd have all sorts of regulations which were increased or made uncertain or threatened that you might increase or might not. You might have a new healthcare program in America, you might not. You might ban offshore drilling, then you might allow it, then you might ban it again. In other words, you have regime uncertainty, as it's come to be called. So investors who are blamed for the loss of animal spirits, well, they ought to bloody well lose animal spirits in the circumstances, since they don't know what's their own, what they can do with it, whether they make any money they're allowed to keep it anyway. So as in 30s America, it's no wonder the investor hangs back. And also, and this is where I don't deny part of the downward spiral idea, I don't deny that given that a slump has been precipitated, then, in the circumstances, especially if politicians start saying, don't worry, everything is perfectly normal, we're fundamentally sound, and we're going to do things utterly unprecedented in peacetime, which gives you the sort of the jitters. Why wouldn't people stop buying cars, stop buying white goods, as they did? I mean, car sales collapsed by 80% or something in the first year, even with the cash for clunkers clunking into place eventually. So a combination of strange things, entirely justified fear, can act in a kind of the feedback mechanism to mean that one man's wise precaution against future uncertainty brings certain ruin to him, quite possibly, and his fellow workers, because people are not consuming. That's the thing. Therefore, the state has to step in and consume on their behalf. Not that it has ever stopped, but it has to be the spender of first and last resort. They used to say lender of first resort. That was badgered, but they've improved upon it to be the spender of first, second, and third resort. So, to make our slump, we have the monetary problem. People are not encouraged to move, they're very much discouraged from moving. Cities are not allowed to grow. Cambridge in this country would grow enormously if it were permitted to, but apparently the dull, flat fens are of such intrinsic merit that the city must not expand. Middlesbrough doubled its size something like every 7 years in the 19th century. These things would happen. No difficulty in it. Now we probably are. Not Middlesbrough so much, but a great many other places that just grewed without planning permission, and Birmingham, indeed, such places. But that is not to be permitted. No, the jobs will be brought to you, or you will have training. That'll do it. Well, it doesn't really do it. I mean, there are more jobs, there are more tasks that humans could perform than there are humans to perform them. I myself would pay £5 an hour to a couple of Nubian slaves coming around in the throne.
I'd pay 50
Well,
pence
actually,
now.
probably 4 or 5 Nubian slaves would be necessary. Coming around in the throne, but I don't think they'd be willing to come forward at such a price. So. But still, there are tasks that humans could perform, and in certain circumstances would. In short, there is no reason for there to be any unemployment at all, let alone my 2 senses, in the usual sense of people willing to offer you a job. Now, how do we create such a circumstance? Well, with regime uncertainty, with taxation, with regulation, and also simply because we're now in a slump. The Keynesians imagine they've explained the slump when they spell out the consequences of a slump. But it's not denied that if people aren't working, if people aren't producing, there aren't the goods there to be exchanged, which is the essential thing. That's the insight of J.B. Say, that it's production that allows for exchange of production, not the money. Keynesians think it's the spending, it's the money, that's what gets things going. So if we can just get money being spent, the economy will start to move. But all that moves is the inflation rate. Now, certain visible things in front of which you can stand for photo opportunities, bridges to nowhere, roads to nowhere, can be built. People can be employed. You can look the good guy. But that's not really getting the economy moving. What has to be done is that production for profitable sale, and you hope it's going to be profitable sale, should be the thing to engage in. And the state doesn't do that. In fact, it ostentatiously does not find things and make something more valuable out of them and then sell them. Very often, even in the most apparently laudable cases, for all they know, this is the economic calculation problem again, for all they know, they've taken valuable inputs and made an output which is slightly less valuable. No matter how much people like it in isolation, like a hospital, a library, a road, I mean, is it better than nothing? Would you rather it wasn't there? Well, no. Given that you've had to pay for it, you'd rather it was there. But only the market can drive people to make the things they ought to be making. It's not enough to be useful, it's not enough to be valuable, as state nurses very often are. You should be the most possible you can be, given present knowledge and entrepreneurial foresight, and that the market allows and that the state does not allow. Right. So, moving right along, we can now see that, unless you buy the Keynesian package, and I do not see it explains the downturn. I do not see how it allows the downturn to be escaped from rapidly. Because because you either have to tax or you have to borrow, or you engage in, or state enterprises are engaged in. And the important thing of moving people, changing methods, if need be cutting wages, but boosting wage rolls, spending can go up if you're worried about spending. Spending is just a side effect of having things worth selling and price to sell. So just to imagine that flooding the country with money will boost demand, it doesn't, it just boosts prices. To boost demand, you must get people back to work. Now, to say they're not working because they're not working, it seems a bit empty, but it's not empty. For every return to work, even at a lower wage, even in a job you don't really care for, even in an area you'd rather not live in, providing you're encouraged or permitted to do such things, wages will rise, you may then move on to another job. But the system is entirely gummed or frozen by government intervention, sadly, which then justifies further intervention because this simply proves the market can't be relied upon. Right, grand finale. What then is to be explained. Not redundancy, that's fairly obvious, that's inevitable. In one sense, employment is inevitable. In the sense of having jobs offered in the papers and people being accepted into employment, as back in the good old days in the 1950s, when there were always advertisements that man wanted apply within, and there were more advertisements than there were people to respond to them. Why was this golden age there? Because, well, I've spotted that earlier, because wages are more free, people were not paid more than they were worth employing at. That's the reason. So, in one sense, full employment is inevitable. In another sense, in the usual sense, there will be redundancy, and there can be chronic unemployment, and there can be chronic mass unemployment, but these things are not market phenomena. They take an awful lot of politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Any questions? David?
Just a very small point. I take issue with the suggestion that you can't blame famine on government. I agree that you probably can't blame crop failure on government.
Yes, yes.
But famine, it always seems to me, is a consequence of there not being enough money, of people not having the wealth to buy food.
Or the freedom.
Or the freedom of people to sell the food to the people where they need it. Now, all those things, the problems of having the marketing of food in the places where people are apparently starving, problems that they don't have the wealth to buy food at the prices then prevailing. So those are in large measure caused.
And the infrastructure, of course, but what we get with Ireland in the 1840s and more recently in Ethiopia in the 1980s, is you had food sent out there, but there wasn't the infrastructure, which would be part of the market, to actually get the food from A to B, to get the food where it's wanted. So even charity fails with a lack of infrastructure. But what happens when the market develops is that we no longer depend upon the local crop. We can trade around the world, which is exactly what the Irish couldn't do because they were not working for money. It's exactly what many of the Ethiopians couldn't do because they weren't working for money. But if you had cash crops, the cash economy, then you've got the infrastructure, and then you can trade around the world and it'll come in.
Apparently, in the case of Ethiopia, that was even more unnatural than it appears. It wasn't so much crop failure, that there was part of that, is that because there was a civil war going on,
Yes.
an entire people were uprooted from where they were sort of scratching a living and dumped in camps where they couldn't possibly make a living,
Yes.
where it was unsanitary and they were developed diseases and did,
Yes.
and then appeared to be in need of outside charity.
And both sides raided the charity. You know, when
yes.
people like Galdor sent food to Ethiopia, both armies in the civil war raided the food.
It's a bit different in Ireland because I think there were charities that could be organised and a lot was done. It was said that Britain stood by, which is of course in a way is letting the Irish be independent, which apparently is what they sort of wanted. But anyway, they didn't do enough, and food was leaving Ireland. But it was high. It was high-priced food, and then cheap food was being sent the other way, which is usually left out of the nationalist picture. It wasn't a good thing, but in those circumstances, those who were simply self-sufficient farmers with a single crop, when that failed, it wasn't very easy to see what could be done, given the numbers.
I think it was basically, as in Ethiopia and Ireland, the lack of logistics or a lack of infrastructure, as I said. Same words mean the same phenomenon. You've got to have an established distribution rate, which of course the market sets up almost automatically. But if you don't have that, if you have no cash crops, then you're not going to have the infrastructure, and you're going to rely on your local produce, and that's the recipe for famine. The solution to famine is free trade.
Well, not simply free trade, but free trade that through time has established an entire international network of growers, shippers.
Well, that's what free trade does. Yeah.
Transport.
As soon as you allow free trade.
Grain stores and the rest of it, yeah.
Not democracy as Sam imagines.
Well, democracy is now used to mean all good things. A warm hand on your entrance would be regarded as a democracy. Instead of people being liberal with one another, it's now regarded as a democracy.
David?
Yeah, it's not really a question, it's more just an observation from personal experience. At the bar, I met a barrister, and one of the things which you have at the bar is you have training by means of a thing called a pupillage, which is where you work for another barrister and you learn your trade and you put your time in, and what you get out of that at the end of it is a training, and then with the training you're then better qualified, and then you can become a tenant, which means that you are a proper barrister, etc., etc. And when I started, anybody who wanted a pupillage, literally anybody who wanted a pupillage could get one. Everybody. There was no problem. It was hard to go on and get a tenancy, but it wasn't a problem getting a pupillage. Now, it's a huge problem, and you see endless complaints by students who say we can't get a pupillage, and no matter how hard we try, and we're wasting all our time, and we're doing all these degrees and all this studying, and it's terrible. Why can't we get pupillage, and something should be done about it? I was thinking, what's happened? Because I haven't really paid any attention to that. Impossible. Has it changed so much in the last 20 years? And I looked at it and I found out what had happened. The Bar Council, which is now and was at the relevant time a statutory regulated body, had passed a rule. And the rule it had passed was that all pupillages had to be paid. And they had to be paid a certain minimum amount. And it was a breach of professional duty to offer a pupillage which was unfunded. So what happened before was that anybody could get a pupillage. And of course, if people were coming along saying, look, I will work, you don't have to pay me for 6 months, you train me, I get paid by training. Fantastic arrangement, everybody agreed. Just stopped. And so because you couldn't have people who were being paid by the training rather than by money, you had to pay them by money, all these pupillages which were previously offered were no longer being offered. And so the result was that you had unemployment in that sense. But if you look to see what caused it, entirely caused by what was in effect a minimum wage. 100%. No explanation. And I put a post up on some website to that effect, and I was pilloried. How dare you suggest going back to the dark old days when people were like, fine, but you haven't got a pupillage, have you? What do you want?
There might be another element to it, which is that given that they're now, so it works in two directions. Given that they now have to pay, they may be less keen to offer them. And given that people are now paid, they might be more keen to have them. So are more applying for them, do you think? Or?
There are other issues what then happened, of course, was that it was said, well, the solution is to cut down the number of people who are allowed to study to become barristers. So what we now have is a whole set of regulations that say you're not allowed even to train by law unless you have a certain set of qualifications. Because, again, when I started, you didn't need a degree to become a barrister.
Very good.
The only thing which you had to do was to eat your dinners. So it was effectively...
I could do that.
Unregulated. Yeah. Whether you earned any money as a barrister afterwards...
I don't mean something else.
Another matter. But so what they've done is they've tried to... And it's a lovely little microcosm of the government. They created a problem. They created unemployment. And their way to deal with it, instead of freeing up the thing that caused it is to
Reduce
say,
the number of applicants.
is to stick in more regulation and say, well, now you're not even allowed to train to become a barrister.
Yeah.
You can't even do the course unless you meet a whole set of qualifications, because that'll mean that we have less pressure on the pupilages, of which there are fewer as we make the rule.
I think here you get the race between the market and the state. And in computing, we had something called contractors, computer contractors, and they were brought in specifically to avoid the problems you got with laying off people under normal employment law. So you employed them for a contract, and then you could just let the contract was finished, you lay them off come what may. There's no problem there. And I notice now that given that the minimum wage thing has come in, the market, they're thinking of ways of getting around it. And I suspect very much that these internships are one way of doing it. In other words, you don't pay them very much or anything at all, and you get them to do training. They get training or they get work.
Precisely the balance.
And I noticed now the trade unions, and I see these headlines. We must pay interns.
Of course.
We must stop this
Yes.
practice of interns not being paid.
During the 1930s, the Great Depression, young people always got jobs. Oh, no problem. Because they were worth employing. So it's not very difficult. It's not heartless. In fact, it's the other way round. It's the well-meaning, apparently, bleeding heart, apparently, interventionists who don't seem to bother to look at the counter-arguments or examine the results of the consequences of what they have advocated. Then it must be good because, well, it's intended to help. Anyway, the union pays us to do it. And not being entirely cynical, I mean, modern parties now are paid to produce legislation. In fact, they don't have to produce it. The World Wildlife Fund or the trade unions will draft the legislation, which is then run through Parliament, and very few MPs read it, and the party concerned gets payment for its election expenses. Looks to me like pure corruption in a sense, but organised corruption, of course. No one will get any prison sentences, not that poor chap getting 2 years or so, isn't it? No, they won't get anything. No. I mean, even when it's public, and Bernie, what's his name, offered $1 million or so not to have a bit of legislation. He got his way, and he got his money back.
That's right.
Oh, there's a bargain.
Bernie Ecclestone.
Bernie Ecclestone, yes. Yeah.
He paid the money to have the rules passed, and then they found out that he'd only had the rules passed because they paid the money, so they paid him the money back. That's right.
There's honour. There's honour for you.
I think you made this. I think you made this point anyway, but the gumming up, the stickiness in the labour market, obviously a large part of that is attributable to a mass of regulation, the volume of which mustn't be underestimated. And it's a shame actually that Paul's not here, because that's something that's a field that he's now working in. He sees it every day. Sort of, I mean, the volume of this stuff, its complexity, the costs associated with it are vast. But put that to one side. There are all the other things as well, as you said, even things that on the face of it don't seem to have anything to do with jobs, housing, and transport, and the ease with which you can move from one place to another. And stamp duty, which on the face of it has nothing whatever to do with jobs, is actually one of the things that gums up labour markets, and all this is. So that I mean, the problem is that there's almost too many explanations. One can point to almost everything that the state does, that the government does, is going to make unemployment worse. There's almost no exception, because everything that it does makes it harder for people to engage in all the voluntary transactions. And that's before one even gets onto what's now being done in the voluntary sector.
Oh, God.
Which was one voluntary, and now that's being regulated as well. So
Yes.
that's another story.
Of course, no libertarian has an objection to regularity, to things being regulated. What should regulate is common law and competition. Those are the two greatest regulators, two greatest overseers of market provision. The rest seems to detract from it more than anything.
I mean, just because I know a bit about employment law, not much because it's not my field, but when I started learning law back in the beginning of the 80s, even employment law, you could say in some shape or form, had an element of freedom of contract about it. But now the situation is that really the only two things which are still free are, and even they are not entirely free, are the decision at the outset whether to employ somebody, which is half free, though you can be sued if you get that wrong. Of course, if you have somebody who brings a discrimination claim, then even at that stage you have problems. And for higher paid jobs, how much you pay. And that's about it. Now, that aside, almost every other feature of the employment contract as it once was is now a matter for statute and for regulation. What you can and cannot do, both as an employee and as an employer during the course of it, is regulated. How it ends is regulated. Who pays how much if it ends is regulated. What happens when the employer changes to another employer is regulated. Sorry, just before I forget, one point which is, I think, very important and is underestimated is that those in favour of all this regulation, one of the things which they say is, well, hear what you say, nasty Mr. Goldstone, but you're a very callous person, because ultimately what we're doing is we are protecting people. We're giving them rights which they wouldn't otherwise have. And the thing which I try to say, yes, that's part of the bloody problem. You get given these rights and you can't get rid of them. So if you're somebody who says,
trade them away.
You can't trade them away. So if I'm 17 and I come along and say, okay, I know I'm entitled to a minimum wage as a result of which I can't get a job. I'm quite happy to trade it away. Where do I sign? I will take a less than minimum wage. I don't want the right. If you're black and you want a job, and there are employers who are thinking, well, if we employ you, we are taking all sorts of risks, not because you're black as such, but because we think, well, we might be exposed to claims for discrimination, so we'd rather not employ you. So if you're black, you'd say, well, actually, fine, okay, where do I sign? I will sign away all those rights, just give me the damn job, okay? And I will sign away all my rights to bring claims for discrimination. I promise not to. You can't do it.
You can do it if you're made redundant and you agree to the redundancy.
There are one or two cases where it's possible. But generally speaking, these things which are called rights, I call them blights. They're not rights, they actually make all these people who are supposedly being protected, if you add it all up, they're actually worse off because they can't trade these things away.
That's right, you've got all these rights in the job you can't get.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So
it's a weird world. Even without congressmen being shot at in America, the result that is in the news, isn't it? Of course, or a senator. Oh, they're 9 people who died. Yeah. It doesn't matter. It's a person who. It's the assassination attempt. That's the bad thing. A politician, for goodness sakes. Anyway, that's going to be used as an excuse of jumping all over the internet, I fear, and licensing websites and what have you. They want to do it, and it'll be an increment towards it. You bet
They
your
hate
life.
the internet, don't
You
they?
bet your life they'll start doing that.
They hate the internet because it is the one thing which they haven't yet regulated to the extent that they want to.
yeah.
What's the point I was reaching? It doesn't really matter. Oh yes, the point I was reaching was that the so-called post-war consensus, in fact it's about 1910, when was Lloyd George's pension scheme? 1910 I think.
1911 was it?
Right, around then.
1911?
If not before, yeah, and Bismarck's was earlier of course. But from then on, and certainly from the Second World War, post-Second World War, the idea that there's a sort of nice, moderate consensus and everyone at the edge is an extreme wacko. No, we've had an immoderate, cavalier, thoughtless, improvident, runaway train centralist consensus. Even now, traffic fines are going up, bins are not being collected in a locality near you. For what reason? So that state, national and local wages can be kept up, and gold-plated pensions can remain plated with gold. That's what's. It may. I don't think they're getting away with it in the long run, but that's being attempted. So you're going to have the tax taken from you. You're going to be taxed. The services you expected are going to be less and more inconvenient, and all to keep up wages which were probably too high anyway, and pensions which they should have arranged for themselves. I don't want to law against these things, but I almost do. That no employee can offer a pension. No, you just get a wage. That's it. You want a pension? You want socks in your sock drawer? Buy some socks. You want a pension? Arrange a pension. You don't get it from the state. You don't get it from your employer. Now, being a libertarian, I would not advocate that, because of course, if your employer, if it's cheaper to the employer to offer a package which is a lower monetary price, he should be free to do it. But I almost want it to be the case, because people should wake up out there. Come on.
David?
I seem to be dominating.
That's all right.
It's better than
They're all jumping in. I can do it.
They're not all jumping in.
But you raise another point there, which is it's another problem with excess, with any regulation. That the more you get, the more that this other problem arises, which is that when you have freedom of contract, true freedom of contract, then you don't just get a thing called a job or a thing called a not job. There are all sorts of ways in which the relationship can be structured. You can have part-time working, you can have contracting working, you can work for one person and be transferred to somebody else, you can be a consultant with a bit of this and a bit of that. There are many, many ways in which ingenuity and innovation can come up with new ways of arranging how work works. One of the problems with regulation, excess regulation, is that it ossifies things. You get stuck with particular kinds of work relationship, and those are defined as the only ones that are allowed to exist. And so the ingenuity and innovation, even in terms of how the employer or the employee can relate to each other and how these things are structured, it can't exist. And so you don't get new kinds of working relationship practice, except as ways to try and get around regulations. You see that?
There is a sort of a hope that you could disguise liberalism as socialism, as perhaps John Stuart Mill was doing, and say, right, none of these things apply if it's a workers' cooperative, for example, or if it's a profit-sharing organisation. That may be a way out of it. Yeah. And it might work. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I didn't realise how still John Stuart Mill was liberal, because I assumed he'd gone to the bad and he'd hooked up with Harriet Martin. Not Harriet Martin.
Harriet Taylor.
Quite, as that was a Harriet did.
Yeah.
And he'd got socialism. But no, he liked the Coke and Gas Company or whatever it was, that was a cooperative of a kind, a profit-sharing organisation. Although he approved of these things, he wanted them to be hammer and tongs in competition with each other, and no state favours, no taxes, no licensing, no the rest of it. So, still a pretty rampant liberal. Yeah. So that might be a way out of it. I had hoped, but the Labour Party, of all things, I thought, well, at least they'll leave working men's clubs alone, as regards these regulations for smoking and no.
Most of them conservative
swept
clubs, anyway.
And conservative. It was swept us. Well, yes, working conservative men. But just
Israeli Tory democracy.
Eat lettuce, smoke outside. Astonishing times we live in. But
yeah.
Stephen?
I don't know, Bob. Is there much to be gained by including the people who claim benefits as state workers? You mentioned the unemployed as being state workers.
It's a way.
Are people who claim housing benefits state workers, or family allowance state workers? I mean, I'm happy with the present tripartite, private sector, state sector, and the benefits.
It's a way of shaking up the analysis, which is too easy and too lazy and too conventional. That's the real reason I do it. Another reason is I think it's true. If a wage means this, that's a wage. Oh, it's not a wage because we don't call it one. Well, it doesn't matter whether you call it such. If functionally it's on all fours with a another kind of wage, like a state employee, then you are a state employee.
You have to work harder for it nowadays than you do.
Well,
when you were-
indeed.
Yes.
Oh, unless you're long-term.
No, they've cut the.
Sickness, not sickness.
It was that you had to sign on once a week, but now you have to sign on every 2 weeks, so that's cutting the workload in half.
I suppose it might be said that things like housing benefit, I mean, it literally is just you fill a form in, forget about it, or not.
I don't criticise those who, in the circumstances, where for very many people who have come through the state education system, they are not worth employing much. They're either in the wrong area and they can't really afford to move, and they've got a council house or subsidised accommodation. I don't blame people for playing the benefit system, not playing it for all it's worth, not having multiple applications and the rest of it. But I don't blame people. I blame the system, which the socialists used to do, and now are the system.
So if I were trying to play devil's advocate here, which is quite hard, because it's not quite hard to, I find it hard to see what the arguments are the other way, but you might say, well, is it in a natural economy, would there be people the value of whose labour is so low that it wouldn't earn them enough to sustain themselves in any shape or form?
Well, they're called.
And could that be? I mean, what's that? I mean,
Well, they're called pets.
Cats and dogs.
Cats and dogs, for example, but they do provide a service,
Yeah.
not marketable. Well,
Well, people are mentally defective. They might fall into that category, but they would depend on charity. But there's so few of them, it really just doesn't.
it ought to be the case, especially in modern medicine and the rest, that we have an ever smaller number who are handicapped and cannot work, because to be able to sit at a keyboard or even just look at a camera and be a security operative must be the easiest thing in the world. And so that should be available to people who can only just sit there and look at a screen and press some buttons. And I mean, modern medicine and modern diagnostics, it should be there are fewer people who are truly handicapped. I know the charity industry wants to have ever more numbers included as handicapped, like a person who is a bit old, who not so nimble on their pens. Well, that's handicapped. The majority is handicapped. We are all handicapped. We're all guilty. Same kind of analysis.
Mainly by regulation. Yes.
Well, handicapped indeed. Or lesser able, or whatever the latest euphemism is. And the lesser abled man shall leap as an hart.
I mean, it is quite striking that the regulation of it's not just the regulation of employment; it's the regulation increasingly of all kinds of forms of association.
Yes. Oh, yes. What with the
as we said, it's voluntary work,
flower arranging in cathedrals,
that sort of thing, and other kinds of.
Yes.
putting up bunting.
Yes, you can't even form a political party and
Well, that's
only let
Whoa.
people who agree with you now. Or when you look at what happened to the British National Party, they were told they've got to change their constitution.
Yes, that's right.
What was wrong with it?
Oh, it was the British National Party
It
constitution.
discriminated
Really like
against
it.
persons not of British origin.
No, not necessarily. Well, no, he may have said you have to be a British citizen. Somebody did it.
Well, there's some claim.
It offended the Race Relations Act, didn't it?
Yes.
It offended the Race Relations Act, so they ordered them to rewrite their constitution, which the new head of
Muslims or something.
the new David Cameron type head of the British National Party,
Dolphin head.
the fellow with one eye. What's his name?
Cyclops?
Cyclops. Oh, Cyclops. Actually,
Brown.
agreed. He said, "Oh yes, I welcome this chance to recast the British National Party."
The new head.
Well, the new head with one eye. What's his name?
I mean, Nick Griffin.
Nick Griffin. That's right. That's
Not
right.
you, not
Nick Griffin. That's right. Yeah.
What they did was
No, I think they just had clauses in the constitution which defined being British, and it was things like of certain Nordic stock and Anglo-Saxon, and I think they included the Irish in there as well. And
They were in with it.
and that was it.
Because the Irish used to exclude the British as being mongrel.
Certain people were excluded.
they changed their rules to allow anybody to be a member as long as they agreed with the principles of the BNP, but they put in a provision that said that that was subject to a home visit.
It's menacing.
You know, and that I think was the thing which got them in trouble the second time. And then it was said that because they'd done that, they were in contempt of court. And that then failed because the original order from the court requiring them to change their constitution was apparently not clear enough. So they got off on a sort of technicality.
But the political parties should just be associations, they shouldn't be. The law should.
Well,
The law should have no. You shouldn't see them.
well, I think when the Race Relations Act originally came in, it was fairly narrowly drawn to the kinds of things which it applied to. And it's spread in two ways. It's spread in terms of the kinds of associations and contracts to which it applies. It now applies to almost everything.
Yep.
And the other thing which has enabled it to spread is that is the idea of indirect discrimination. Because originally the idea was
If you allow someone to discriminate.
race discrimination was originally it was originally explained in a sense that you could sort of understand. It basically meant being beastly to black people, and that was sort of, you could understand what was meant by it. Whether you thought that it was something which ought to be covered by law or not is another matter. One we obviously have a view, but you could sort of understand what was covered by it. And then what happened was that it was expanded to cover something called indirect discrimination.
And unconscious discrimination as well.
Which meant anything that might indirectly
Non-actual
have the
discrimination.
effect,
Yes.
It's a type of discrimination.
anything that might have the effect of operating adversely on one group rather than another.
In the subjective opinion of the person who's the victim.
Yeah, well, that's yet another gloss that came out of the
Just to make sure.
But so what that meant was that if, for example, you had a job which you wanted done, you weren't allowed to, for example, employ men because they were stronger, because that would be indirect discrimination. You couldn't have a requirement that people must have a certain degree of strength.
Yeah, they did this
To
in
do.
the fire service. Yeah.
Because even if that's necessary for the job, it would be indirect discrimination because it would adversely...
We're discriminating against weaker people.
Precisely. But since more
Including men.
women than men are weaker people, you had, prima facie, you were then breaching the law.
But if the women
I
only
had to learn
rescue,
this
if the
stuff.
women only rescue women, they would be the right
Well, the way that they
strength
then
to weight ratio.
dealt with that nonsense, having brought in a law that said you couldn't discriminate against weak people, will say, all right then, if it's indirect discrimination, we'll allow it if it's objectively justified to be decided by the court. So what will then happen is that if the fire service said we want strong people because it's a job that requires strong people, you would then get a discrimination claim brought by women. And then the court would decide if the requirement for strong people was objectively justified by the requirements to be a strong fireman. So that instead of it being bargained between the parties, it became a matter for adjudication by the courts.
Yes, there's also, this nonsense is endless.
It is.
There was something recently, they're cutting back the state, okay, tentatively at the moment, to bring the books into balance. But they said, well, this may be discriminatory because more women are employed by the state
Yes, that's right.
than by the men, and therefore that is discriminating.
That's right,
Yeah, but the men could say that it was discrimination that so many women were employed by the state.
No, you're not allowed to do that. No.
Oh, we can't counter claim.
These things don't work against minorities. I mean,
There's
they're
one
supposed to be
famous case where they did
Women aren't a minority.
No, they're not.
Majority.
yeah,
Remember that, yeah, please.
They are they are a minority.
favoured
No
group.
matter how many are there.
They're not allowed to work against favoured groups.
Stephen is absolutely right. This stuff multiplies itself. I mean, really, you have to read the law reports just to see.
Weigh them, I should have thought, is enough.
Well, right.
You always work for somebody, I suppose, which is what we need.
It is-
Jobs.
Jobs, yeah.
For lawyers.
It is beyond belief. It really is quite extraordinary just how mad it all becomes. The apotheosis of the madness, I think, Although I'm
Oh,
sure-
we've reached it.
Oh, well,
I hope.
No.
I was thinking exponential.
There was the case involving the Jewish free school, where the Jewish free school was on the receiving end of a discrimination claim by a Jew on the basis that the school only admitted Jews. And this boy was not as Jewish as he needed to be admitted. So he brought a discrimination claim. And the discrimination was said to be by Jews against non-Jews. Now, of course, that caused real problems, because that's all that very politically difficult. We don't really want to have a case about that. Now, the short answer was, of course, the Jewish free school is discriminating. Can't be any doubt about it. Of course it is discriminating, because it says we want to have Jews as pupils, not anybody else. But that couldn't be said, because so the lawyers acting for the Jewish free school couldn't say that, because the one thing which they couldn't say was that we are discriminating. So they tried to say, well, we're not discriminating.
Selecting.
We're selecting. And the argument that they wanted to say, which they tried to say, caused all sorts of problems. They said, well, what they sort of half said was, well, we're not a racial group, so that's not discrimination.
That's true.
But the problem with that is that at the same time, the Jewish community did want to be a racial group, because they wanted to be protected by the very laws they're on the receiving end of in this case.
Byzantium.
And if you read the House of Lords judgment in that case, it is the combination of tortuous logic and intellectual gymnastics and political correctness that suffuses the whole thing. It's just painful to read.
Surely that would have made the lawyers so happy.
Yes, oh, they love it. They love it, yeah.
It did. I
They love
know.
it.
I knew one of the council. I know one of the council involved. She loved it. It was fantastic. It was all very interesting.
Can this continue? Well, it will continue, obviously, but you hope it is not. It cannot be exponential, rather like CO2. It's a bit logarithmic.
The whole thing
It must undermine itself. It must.
Well, it does, yeah. I mean, I think, the whole idea of,
Sorry, no, you're on.
the whole idea of like SDE, so self-defined ethnicity, which permeates everywhere now. So you can't be discriminated against when you tick these boxes, when you join virtually every company, certainly a large company or government agency. But the fact is, what actually happens in reality is that the people you're working for, the people you're working with, they actually see this. So they know what your SDE is, and it gives them the opportunity, if they want to discriminate against you, which they wouldn't have had before.
Klingon.
Well, I can give examples, but
Sure, yeah.
that's what actually happens.
I don't know. Stop.
People have said, they get a little group, for example, and say, oh, do you know, for example, he's Klingon, rather than saying anything.
Sure, yeah.
Now, I couldn't believe that, could you? And it would go around the group, and then that would allow these people to discriminate against this guy or woman, which they wouldn't have been able to before, because they would never have known that.
There is
All bad then.
There is the Italian. There is
It defeats the object.
There is the Italian manoeuvre.
Thank God for that.
There is the Italian manoeuvre, if that's not racist and or anti-nationalist, and it may not even be true, that you ignore it. Yes, you sign up to it.
But we don't.
I know, we don't. The French, you see, they sign up to things and then have one man in Bordeaux with the job of policing the whole of France as regards this regulation. Apparently, that's the way it works. But we
don't.
It's almost heartwarming to see how much we still respect if it's bloody law anyway.
Right.
This so-called law.
It is. You're right.
But we do always.
Respect for the rule of law has had the unfortunate.
And you want it. You want that to be part of a society.
And
it's a marvellous thing, but it's wasted.
Well, the point goes further actually, because one of the great problems, of course, with all this stuff and rubbish, is that people increasingly, and this is in some senses it's a good thing, of course, they think, well, it is stuff and rubbish. What's being called law is just stuff and rubbish, and we shouldn't pay any attention to it. But then that has the adverse consequence, or could do, that respect for proper laws, which we do want, can also get damaged in the process. I don't think it does though. Actually, I think people are actually...
They can see the difference.
I think people can see
Well, you can see the difference, but where is the proper law?
Well,
That's what I want to know.
There's a bit of common
Is
law.
there some proper law there
There's
somewhere?
a bit of common law.
Somewhere there, yeah.
Yeah.
It's hidden under the statutes, doesn't
Yeah.
it?
It also produces a situation if you fall foul of some bureaucrat is 90 to 1 that will have some way of getting you.
well, that's a bit sinister.
That's a problem with discretion. That so much of it's bad enough to have all these regulations. The worst thing, it's becoming a problem here. It's a big problem in the States. Is not only do you have a mass of regulation, but you have a mass of regulation which confers discretionary powers on regulatory bodies. At least if you've got regulations that say what they say and the courts decide what they mean, you're on the right side or you're on the wrong side, but at least
You know what it is.
you know what it is.
Yeah.
Increasingly, there is a problem now that you don't know what it is, and the people who say what it is are the regulatory body. And Jeremy's absolutely right there. That's a separate, serious problem. It's not quite the same problem. It probably deserves its own talk, because there are real problems there in terms of regulatory bodies being given powers, and where not much, as Jeremy said, because it's also uncertain. They will get you. If they want to get you, then they'll get you.
There's a thing on the blog this week about who's been given derogation from the new health thing in the States.
Yeah, it's a bigger problem in the States.
All the, you know, if you're selling health insurance, you can't sell minimum health. You've got to have all the bells and whistles, but you can get derogation from this. And if you happen to be a trade union, which is selling health insurance, you get it.
Well, the Obama, one of the first things he did was to change the pecking order in an insolvency case with General Motors.
General Motors, yeah, government motors.
Yeah, instead of I don't know the pecking order, it goes in bondholders, whoever. Well, a taxman first, then the banks and the bondholders and this and this. But apparently, just bumped the union up the front.
That's right. Gave them 20% of the company or something, which they did.
Can I just come back just very quickly about what you said about where these things, these trivial laws, which we were talking about, like self-defined ethnicity, for example, things like that, when they get so ridiculous, as what this gentleman was talking about, how they impinge on other laws. And we were saying, well, we don't think they do. I think they do, in a big way. And I'll give one example, simple example, is the introduction of the smoking law, for example. There are many places where smoking was banned. You look at the old smoke rooms in pubs, where you go and have a smoke because it was be banned in the bar or the lounge. And the whole idea of criminalising smoking and making it enforceable by police officers was because the government considered that management had collapsed and people just weren't taking any notice of these laws anymore. For example, you would have a no smoking zone in a pub or a restaurant or a hotel. People just would ignore it.
I don't think they did. I think in this country we were horribly
the only way
British about it.
Well, the only way to enforce it was to make it enforceable by with police officers in the street, criminalise it.
No, I wouldn't. It's even.
Just a simple example.
Yeah, if I may jump in, it's even more creepy than that. And this started a while back. Enoch Powell, and I'm not a racist. Enoch Powell said when the idea was introduced that drugs barons would have their, you had to prove that it wasn't ill-gotten gains. He said it won't stop here. If you allow this in, it'll be extended to all sorts, and of course it was. And in the same way...
Sorry, if you allow what? Drugs in?
No, you
Confiscation.
confiscate assets, even the assets used to hire a lawyer to prove your innocence in court, as it happens in America. They take all the money away from someone and then say, you'll have your day in court with the freebie. The freebie chap who's no good. But what the insidious part is that then and later on, this happened with... people climbing into lorries and coming over the channel instead of making that a crime, it shouldn't be a crime, but at least I can understand that. So you're here, you're an illegal immigrant. What kind of crime is that? But still, you can sort of make it a crime. You're not taken to court, you're just simply deported. But they made it a crime to be an innocent lorry driver who didn't realise that someone had climbed into the back of the van. Now, once they started that game, they policed themselves. It's much better. You don't need to send a plod round. He can sit in his arse in the canteen or surfing the web, as they like to do, or driving around in pairs in a car talking to each other so they can avoid looking at people that might be committing crimes. So we now have the landlord in danger of losing his licence because someone is smoking. Now, we might have been sufficiently Italian, as it were, to just let people smoke in pubs. I'm not going to snitch. You're not going to snitch. We'll just smoke. Oh no. One troublemaker could simply say that there'd been smoking. The police wouldn't go in. The police didn't want to go in, probably. But they're so much in fear of losing their licence that they'll police themselves.
Yeah, I mean, what amazed me about this whole scenario is how effective this was.
Oh,
It worked like that.
In a sense, it's
only one person,
very
as far
efficient.
as I know, only one person was killed over it. That was a bouncer in a nightclub in South London.
David?
Well,
It's quite incredible how effective it was.
You're absolutely right, Bob. That is increasingly a legislative and regulatory technique that's used. And there's a similar example also in the immigration context. I don't know if it's yet been brought into law, but I wrote about this in the days when I used to write blogs. There was a proposal, which I'm sure he's going through. It actually originally came from the EU. And the proposal was that, again, it didn't make being an illegal immigrant illegal. What it made illegal was employing illegal immigrants.
Yes.
And
Making the man useful and...
exactly. And of course, the threat of that, if actually employing the man who you would otherwise, we would all happily employ somebody, I don't care whether they're illegal or not, if they can do a good job and they can cut my lawn or whatever, fine. But the point at which I might be committing a criminal offence by employing him, then it's a different question.
And of course, the irony is
Careful.
that you'll get away with paying him less.
Well, quite, because
If he's illegal and you're running a risk, well, I'll hire you, but so he'll get less.
He'll get less.
So the idea was you're going to protect the man from exploitation.
He'll get less.
He'll get less. Yeah.
But it's a very effective technique, and we see quite a lot of it.
Can't we do it with them? Can't we make politicians responsible for crimes committed by non-politicians?
PAYE, of course, was all about that. PAYE was, well, what we'll do is we won't regulate income tax the difficult way, which is to go against every employee who doesn't pay his tax. We will regulate the employer.
Yeah.
He's an easy target. We'll say, if you don't deduct it, you've got to pay it. Very effective.
Yes.
You see it all the time. Anyway, that's just
And I was only born 40 years after this nonsense started.
that was a great tool. Thank you very much indeed.
Conversational. Are we to the bar? Are we?
Thank you. Richard, did you want to say something?
So people ask, what was the logical conclusion of endless government interference in employment law and extra rules about minimum wages and employee rights? And it is a subject to which I've already given some thought in the past. So just in case anyone wants to know, this is what happens. Right, are you familiar with the scene in Dr. Zhivago when, after the revolution, the People's Commissar says, right, we're going to deal with homelessness, collects all the homeless people in St. Petersburg or Moscow and starts delivering them to people's houses and says, right, you've got 2 people in an 8-bedroom house, here's your share of the homeless. So I'm thinking that the way that employment law is going to go, as they make up more rules which then make it more difficult to get a job, the solution is to collect up the unemployed and start bringing them to employers. So someone goes to the sink estate, gets a dozen bayonettas.
That makes sense.
To the nearest McDonald's.
It's a way of undercutting the regulation, isn't
And
it?
says, right, this is your share. You have got to employ them. You've got to pay them a minimum wage. And you've got to give them this list of rights. and then that takes 1,000 people to a car factory or 2 people to a newsagent's and says, right, that's your share of unemployment.
Provided they could pay less tax pari passu, that might even make some sense.
Well, what will,
It'd be a way of undermining the cost of the regulation, wouldn't it?
well, what will probably happen is that
Certainly the people who didn't want them were given them.
Well, everybody, including all these former unemployable people, will have to pay taxes, which will be used to subsidise the employers for taking them on.
What you don't realise is Atlas will eventually shrink. You won't stand for this.
Yeah. Or some parts of the world will be more sensible. I'm yearly awaiting. You know what happened with Hong Kong and the Chinese? So I'm waiting for a Chinese fleet to arrive and claim the Isle of Wight as a free port, and start practicing capitalism so close to our shores that it has the effect of turning us back. Is that it?
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.